In his book, The Tao of Willie, singer, songwriter, and yes, author Willie Nelson writes, I learned some invaluable lessons in Nashville that apply to both farming and show business. Do not corner something that you know is meaner than you. Keep skunks of all kinds at a distance. If you forgive your enemies, it messes up their heads. I never met a pig or a record executive worth holding a grudge over anyway. Whatever your opinion of Willie, it seems to me that his United Methodist roots may be coming through in that quote. Keeping score and getting even with our enemies seems to be what much of our world holds as its rule of living. For many of us, our natural instinct is to retaliate when someone hurts us. We want to lash out. We want to get even. None of this forgiveness business for us. When the score is settled, then, maybe then we can talk about forgiveness, but not until then. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. One side strikes and the other side thinks it has to strike back. To do otherwise would be seen what? As a sign of weakness. So retaliation is the rule of the day. Unfortunately, what we end up with is a never-ending cycle of violence and a diminishing prospect for peace. What then do we make of these kingdom ethics Jesus is teaching in today's passage from Luke? Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Forgive. Do these teachings have any relevance for us today? Are they really practical? Can they work in a world dead set on getting revenge? For the most part, we humans aren't accustomed to doing good to those we consider enemies. It's not the way we're wired, it seems. Oh, sure, it's easy enough to love those people who love us, but it seems next to impossible to love our enemies. That's just not the way it works. Yet, that is exactly what Jesus is suggesting we do. Surely he's not serious, we think. He's speaking in hyperbole again. That's Jesus always going overboard. But that is what the passage says, isn't it? The question is why? Where is Jesus going with this turn the other cheek stuff? You know, I think Jesus understood human nature better than anyone before or since. And in this passage, he was encouraging his followers to break the cycle of hurt and violence that was and is so much a part of our world. Think about it. He never advocated violence or spitefulness for any reason, under any circumstance, not even when his own life was on the line. That's simply not who he was. Jesus was about peace and harmony and community, about things that bring us together, not things that tear us apart. His ministry was a life of love in action, and his good deeds always matched his words. His whole life was an embodiment of God's love and God's grace. Everything he did personified this God of love. And so I believe that Jesus is challenging us to break that cycle of hurt and violence as well. Violent actions, hurtful behaviors, abusive and harmful words. But as long as we respond to the hurts in our lives by lashing out and striking back, that cycle will never end. If people continue to act out of vengeance and a need for retribution, then the cycle of hurt and violence that so engulfs our world will simply continue. and conflict will remain the order of the day. I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who once said that if we continue to live by an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we'll end up blind and toothless. So why not give this foolishness of Jesus a try? This turn the other cheek way of living that he advocates so strongly. Personally, if I'm honest, I find that forgiveness is one of the most difficult things we have to do in life. When I get hurt, I'm much more prone to pout and stew and lick my wounds, or to perhaps stubbornly lash out. And it takes me a good long while to get around to even thinking about this whole notion of forgiveness. We all know that life in community is not easy, do we not? People hurt each other every day, sometimes intentionally, sometimes without meaning to or even knowing they've done so. And when those hurts and resentments go unresolved, when the wounds we inflict on each other are allowed to fester and grow, conflict is inevitable. Conflict between individuals, conflict between groups, conflict between nations. That's what happens when people are unable or unwilling to forgive. But what exactly is forgiveness? And how is it that some people can do it so readily while others of us seem to never be able to let go of an offense? To begin with, I want to say, forgiveness is a complex and complicated concept. And it is something that should never, ever be trivialized. It's not something that you casually hand out like the Sunday bulletin you get at church on Sunday mornings. I also think it's complicated by a lot of assumptions that are both psychologically and theologically incorrect. So maybe it would be helpful to begin by defining what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not the same as toleration. Hear that. Forgiveness is not the same as toleration. When we forgive someone, that doesn't mean we condone or continue to tolerate their offensive or hurtful or harmful behavior. And it doesn't mean that we excuse it or pretend that it just doesn't matter, because it does. You see, it's that kind of erroneous thinking that keeps people in harmful or abusive relationships year after year after year. And that is never, ever good. But neither is avoidance. It doesn't help a hurtful situation any more than toleration does. Reconciliation is what is needed, what is desired, but that can't occur if we simply avoid the situation or if we pretend that it doesn't matter. But again, hear this. If you hear nothing else, hear this. Reconciliation is not always possible or desired, because toxic relationships are toxic. And if reconciliation means allowing someone to continue to treat you in a toxic manner, then reconciliation is not possible if that other person is not willing to change. The second thing I want to say is that forgiveness doesn't mean that we'll automatically feel better, does it? In fact, lingering pain may well be a consequence of a hurtful action even after forgiveness is given. Sometimes that hurt is so deep that it takes years to heal. But that doesn't mean we haven't forgiven the person who hurt us, does it? The third thing, forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. We've all heard people say, just forgive and forget, right? But that's not reality, and folks, it's not helpful either. Our humanness doesn't allow us to forget, and it shouldn't. Sometimes it's our remembering that keeps us from putting ourselves in that same hurtful situation over and over again. Remembering isn't bad. It's what we do with those memories that's important. Do we learn from them? Or do we use them to keep resentment and anger alive and all-consuming? Are we in bondage to our memories, or can we use our memories to exercise the freedom to forgive? The fourth thing forgiveness is not. Forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship will be the same as it was before. Sometimes we must simply make peace with that fact, because when trust is broken, it's not always possible for that trust to be fully restored. On the other hand, by God's grace, the damaged relationship may actually end up being better as new ways of relating are learned and implemented. Either way, the relationship may never be the same, and that's okay. So that's what forgiveness is not, or at least some of what forgiveness is not. But what is forgiveness? Here's what Frederick Buechner has to say. To forgive someone is to say one way or another, you've done something unspeakable, and by all rights I should call it quits between us. Both my pride and my principles demand no less. However, although I make no guarantees that I'll be able to forget what you've done, and though we may both carry the scars for life, I refuse to let it stand between us. I still want you for my friend. Buechner continues, to accept forgiveness means to admit that you've done something unspeakable that needs to be forgiven. And thus, both parties must swallow the same thing, pride. This seems to explain what Jesus meant when he says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Jesus is not saying, though, that God's forgiveness is conditional upon our forgiving others. God's forgiveness of us is not conditional upon our forgiving others. Instead, he continues, what Jesus apparently is saying is that the pride which keeps us from forgiving is the same pride that keeps us from accepting forgiveness. And so we must ask God to please help us to do something about that. When someone you've wronged forgives you, you're spared the dull and self-diminishing throb of a guilty conscience. When you forgive someone who has wronged you, you're spared the dismal corrosion of bitterness and wounded pride. For both parties, forgiveness means the freedom again to be at peace inside their own skins and to be glad in each other's presence. That quote is from his book, Wishful Thinking, A Seeker's ABC. In a sense, forgiveness is surrendering your power over the person who hurt or offended you. It's setting them free. It's granting them pardon without harboring resentment. It's letting go and allowing yourself to be free as well. Allowing yourself to be free, to be healed. Because really, forgiveness is a byproduct of the healing process. As we focus on our own healing, we choose how we will define ourselves, do we not? And with forgiveness, we realize that we don't need grudges and resentments and self-pity and anger and hatred to define who we are. That's not who we want to be. So with God's help, we can begin to define ourselves by God's grace, a grace that makes us whole, rather than by the hurts that tear us apart. And oddly enough, this usually happens when we're able to begin to see the person who hurt us with the same eyes of grace that what? That God sees us. Earlier this week on Facebook, a colleague posted a quote about forgiveness. I thought it was rather timely. She said, it says, it took me a long time to understand what it means to forgive someone. I always wondered how I could forgive someone who chose to hurt me. But after a lot of soul searching, forgiveness is not about accepting or excusing their behavior. It's about letting it go and preventing their behavior from destroying my heart. This morning, as we celebrate Holy Communion, and as we pray for the delegates to our General Conference, let us remember that God's grace is bigger than all that seeks to hurt and divide. For on the night in which he gave himself over to be killed, Jesus offered forgiveness to all of us who are cowardly at times, mean-spirited at times, loving, hateful, compassionate, and self-serving at times. Jesus knew that those gathered around the table were less than perfect, still not able to live out God's will for the kingdom. But Jesus wanted them and us to know that with God there is love and mercy and, yes, forgiveness. This is my body. This is my blood poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me. As we eat this bread and drink from this cup, may we also swallow our pride and learn to forgive those who trespass against us, just as we accept the forgiveness of our gracious God. Thanks be to God. Amen.